Hi, this is AnnHelen. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to size up your facial or portrait drawing successfully, and how to prevent some of the common pitfalls that artists face when they're trying to make a drawing bigger. If you've seen my other tutorials, you know I always encourage you to make your drawing smaller. But let's say you have this wonderful piece of drawing and you have done your preparation and practice, and you're now ready to make it into a much bigger drawing. And this is when you will face some challenges that you didn't have to face when you were making the drawing smaller. And one of them is getting the facial proportions correct. Surprisingly, getting the proportions correct is much harder on even just a slightly bigger drawing. So what I do is first convert the original reference photo into black and white, and I print out a copy of the reference photo to the same size of the drawing that I want to draw. I attach the printout right next to my sketch pad. First, I make sure that on my drawing pad or drawing paper, I'm using the same width and height as that on the reference photo. This will help prevent some of the scaling issues that may come up later on. And because your reference photo is on the same drawing surface, you can more easily see the differences in the height and the width of the drawing you're making. In the photo, which I got from Pinterest and converted to black and white, the photo doesn't contain the top of her head, and I decided to just go with it. So I measured out the total length of her face from the edge of the frame of the photo, from the top to her chin. And now I measure the widest part of her face, which is the highest part of her cheeks, using my pencil, and transfer that same width to my paper. Double check to make sure that you have your width correct. And I do the same to measure the length of the head and the face, starting from the frame or the top edge of the photo. Now from the hairline to the eyebrow line, and from the eyebrow line to the nose, and now from the bottom of the nose to the bottom of the chin. From the marks I've made on my paper, I start drawing the frame of the face, but once again, looking very closely at my reference photo, and I'm constantly comparing and measuring the widths and the heights of the different parts of the face or facial features. This is the center of the face, which is probably one of the most important parts of the face. I'm spending my time making sure that I have the right width between the eyes, looking at the shadows and not just looking at them, but actually using my pencil to measure the space between the eyes and that of the eyes themselves. If you're new to this method of scaling up your portrait or facial drawing, give yourself some time. Learn to measure the different proportions of eyes, nose using your pencil. Keep practicing and you will find it to be very beneficial in the future. At this point, I'm pretty much done with the cranial constructions, the facial features, but it looks kind of weird without other parts of the portrait that I see in the photo. So I'm making a decision right now as to what else I need to include in this portrait. I've decided to include part of the shirt that is showing at the lower right corner of the photo, and also the hands, especially the part of the hand that is on the lower left corner of the photo. They seem to serve as a really nice frame for this picture, so I'm going to include that as well. I'm putting in some lines to help me save some of the shadows or the ends of the shadows in the beginning or more lighter areas on the face before I start shading in. From the reference photo, I identified the darkest values or the darkest areas in the hair and in the skin. And I start shading from the darkest areas that I see. That includes the left side of her face and the left side of her head, because the light is coming from the top but also to the right of us. Her hair is relatively dark compared to her skin tone, so I shade in her hair first. I'm not too worried about the highlights in the hair because I know that even though they're highlights, they're probably darker than the skin tones. At this point, I'm thinking that the printout of the photo that I have on the left is actually not a good representation of the values of the skin tones, because photos tend to make the darks too dark and wipe out the whites. And even you can probably see that the darks on the left side of her face is way too dark. So this is one of the things you need to watch out for when you're using a photo reference. So I'm putting the original black and white version of this photo back on the screen so that you can better see the actual value or tonal differences in the different areas of this image. I've just started shading in the skin tones again from the darker areas to the lighter areas. There's a bit of cast shadow behind her shirt on her neck, so I started shading there. Slightly lighter than that area is the left side of her face, especially on the left side of the nose bridge. So I'm working from the left side of the nose bridge first, and I will gradually move on to the areas of less and less shadow. I'm shading in the slightly shadow and darker areas of her skin with the 2B pencil, using more pressure with my hand as I'm shading in the darker areas, and using less pressure in the areas that aren't as dark. And I'm holding my pencil pretty far away from the tip, so that forces my hand to relax. I don't use much blending in my facial or portrait sketches, but when I shade very lightly and consistently, I don't really need to blend. If you feel like you have learned something from this tutorial, or have simply enjoyed watching it, please click the like or thumbs up button, and please leave me a comment or any suggestions to help make my tutorials better. Thank you so much for your support.